Kenmore Planning Commission. First item on the agenda is citizen comment. Any citizen wishing to render comment, please step forward to this podium. State your name, state your address, and please limit your comments to 3 minutes. Do we have a sign-in sheet?
We do. Anna Rice is the first name.
Okay. Anna?
Hi, my name's Anna Rice. I live at 7511 Northeast 169th Street. And I'm really concerned about all of the trees that have been cut down in our neighborhood over the last year. There have been almost 30 new houses built just within like a 2-block radius of our house. And there must have been 150 trees or something that have been cut down, and I'm talking about big trees. And it's changed the look of our neighborhood completely. When we bought our house 5 years ago, we couldn't see our neighbors on either side, and now I'm looking into somebody else's window, which I know is part of development that happens, but the trees, it's really changed just the feel of our neighborhood. All of a sudden we have, flat lawns where there used to be forest, and I'm really concerned that this is really going to change the feel of Kenmore as a city, and I'd like you to consider that in your planning.
Thank you, Anna.
I think it's Harley Roderick.
Okay, Harley?
Let's see.
Lori, what was the name you pronounced just now? Was it Harley?
My name is Harley Roderick.
Okay. I wanted to be sure I got it right.
That's my dad's idea.
Okay.
I live at Northeast 167th Street in Kenmore.
Okay.
I'd like to start with a little bit from a book here. You might know it. At the far end of town, where the grickle grass grows, and the wind smells slow and sour when it blows. I ask if that's how you want the wind to smell in Kenmore, slow and sour. I think we speak for the trees. Since my family has lived in Kenmore, 3 big housing developments have been put in, and hundreds of trees have been cut down. Developers like D.H. Horton, who are based out of state, don't replace or plan developments with old growth trees in mind. They just clear cut and erase trees. I think we speak for the trees. Kenmore has 2 to 3 pairs of nesting bald eagles, hawks, owls, and ravens. These types of birds would not be in Kenmore if it weren't for the protection of the tall trees. This is a photo I took of an eagle in a tree behind my house. I took this photo. The groves of dug trees are interdependent as they rely on each other for wind protection. When a grove of dug firs is clear-cut, it makes other groves more vulnerable to high winds. And this is a photo of a tree that my neighbor cut down, the big one right in the middle. And you can see after its removal, it's not a very good picture, but this is my tree. And after its removal, you can see it's naked on one side where the one was removed. They're like buddies. They depend on each other. And I think we speak for the trees. Lastly, this is the most recent grove that was lost. I'll circle it in red so you can see it. This was last Tuesday. Here's during. This is on the corner of 79th Place Northeast and Northeast 167th Street. Again, last Tuesday. And this is the after picture. And this is where the grove would be. And that's on the corner of my block. And the neighbors and citizens of Kenmore ask you to please start looking at this. It's changing Kenmore. Thank you.
Thank you, Harley.
The next person on the list is Rob Sumner.
Hi, my name is Rob Sumner. I live at 16715 79th Place Northeast, Kenmore. And my wife, I'm a school teacher. My wife and I chose to live in Kenmore partly because we think it's a beautiful town, proximity to St. Edward, number of lovely parks, Lake Washington and such. And you know, I drive on 170th to drive to my home on 79th Place. And I'm just stunned on my drive home how the landscape, you know, called the urban or suburban geography, what you will, of this area has altered. To the right of us, where there was once one home, it's been sold, it's been bulldozed. Well over a dozen Douglas firs have been clear cut from it. 4 homes are coming in. Further up the street, around the corner, Harley, my neighbor, already mentioned that one. Another area that was, you know, well over a dozen trees, including a well-established big leaf maple, clear cut, not a single tree left in the ground. The next day, a number of crows wandering the neighborhood, wandering into our yard that had not been there previously, looking aimlessly, wondering, you know, where they belong. Further up the street, there's the Dahlia Court, another area of a substantial clear cut. Further up the street, along 170th, on the left, a new developed Lexar Homes, yet another clear cut. What I find in common with each of these areas, not a single tree is left. I find it unsettling, to say the least. I took a moment to look at the ad copy of a couple of the developers that are building, you know, $600,000, $700,000 homes in Kenmore and selling them. Lexar Homes says they're, quote, building stronger communities while adhering to principled ethics, making decisions beneficial to the environment. This is right off their website. I'm curious what they find beneficial to the environment if just clear cuts on substantial hills are part of decisions beneficial to the environment. D.R. Harton talked about the good life in Kenmore. Talked about living in Kenmore provides endless opportunities for outdoor fun, and it called it one of the most beautiful cities in Washington. I'm curious what they consider beauty, and if it includes some of our native beauty and the natural beauty that our city does boast. And then, I mean, I could go on. I think I'll stop there. I brought my daughter. She's 7. When the clear cuts went down the street, she cried on the way to school. I mean, it's clearly having I would say, a visceral impact on numerous citizens in this town. And I find it curious, especially when there's developers that aren't even based in state. They're clearly interested in Kenmore, but they're here to make money. And ultimately, I mean, if they're being motivated by their profits, I'm wondering how invested they are in our community. And that's you know, I think about, I would hope that this will be a city in which nature is not solely consigned to the parks, and is actually more incorporated throughout the town. So, thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Monica Albin.
Hi, good evening. My name is Monica Albin. My address is 7108 Northeast 187th Street, Kenmore, Washington 98028. Again, I love trees. However, there are some trees that I believe do need to come down because of safety hazards. And I'm talking about the new development that's 18507 71st Street Avenue Northeast here in Kenmore. I've taken pictures and I brought those with my phone to show you that these trees are bending over the sidewalk into the road, which is well traveled Monday through Friday with the school from 7:50 in the morning to 3 o'clock at night, and then also on the weekends. We've had windstorms here and we've lost some branches recently. We also have these 2 trees that are going to, if they don't kill a child walking down the sidewalks or a car going down to school to pick up, to drop off, it's gonna ruin a couple of homes that it's going straight for it. Again, I have talked to the developer at this address. he has shown me his plot, which the city has required if trees are removed, what needs to be replaced. I feel very comfortable about that, and I think that that's kind of, you know, development's going to happen, and again, we can keep some trees, but I think when you take all the trees down and you leave 2 single ones standing, as you pointed out, there's nothing to keep the wind from really blowing, and that's kind of what's going on in this particular area. So I would like us to look at getting these 2 trees down before it really harms somebody and takes someone's life. Did you want to see the pictures that I'm referring to, or have you guys driven by the trees?
Here's what I'd suggest, Monica. Have you printed those pictures?
No, I haven't. They're on my phone, but I can surely email them.
That would be better,
Okay.
I think. Print them out. If they're in color, even better.
Okay.
And then give them to the staff, and they'll put it in as part of your citizen comment
Okay.
when they give us materials next time.
Okay, and I guess I just want to know, I'm curious, as far as I understand, you're going to hear all of our concerns and our comments and things like that, but when is something going to be decided as we're getting into that windy season before something happens? Because I know right now the builder isn't doing the blacktop or stuff yet, so now it's perfect timing to get those trees down. So what can we do to expedite that?
Okay. So this isn't really a debate.
Okay.
It's a one-sided thing where we hear everybody, but I will say, so I don't want to invite people to expect me or anybody else to engage in a dialogue, but the city council makes the ultimate decision.
Okay.
We make a recommendation to them, and they'll make the ultimate decision.
Okay, and I think the builder's done a really good job with showing us the neighborhood, the plot for different plants to go into those places, just so that you know that.
Okay?
Okay, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Monica.
Christy Allen.
Hi there, I'm Christy Allen. I live at 18526 71st Avenue Northeast in Kenmore. And I spoke last time. I live across the street from the new development that's happening at 18507 71st Avenue Northeast. They did take some trees down. There's 2 standing right across my driveway. And I'm so nervous and scared since that last storm, August 29th. And in the years past, some of the branches from the trees across the street blew into my house, damaged the roof and skylights. And so I'm more worried about my safety, the kids walking on the sidewalks to Kenmore Elementary. So I don't know about the rest of the area in Kenmore. I'm more concerned about 71st Avenue Northeast, the same road to Kenmore Elementary. I'm more concerned about that area, that the trees remaining be taken down, because it's for safety, hazards, telephone wires, and I know the developer is going to do a nice job with the new landscaping, and he will replace a different type of tree that's not so dangerous in that area. So that's my only comment, right in that area where I live on 71st Avenue Northeast. Thank you. I love trees. I have a lot of trees in my yard. They're Japanese maple and different types. They're not the evergreen type. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy.
Bev Thorson.
Hi, my name is Bev Thorson. I'm at 1881970 First Avenue Northeast, and I'm just down the street there. I sent pictures last meeting and pointed out that some of them are leaning right over the roadway, and it is a really busy thoroughfare, and if they come down, I really am worried that they are dangerous, and so I agree with their viewpoint, and anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev.
She's currently signing in. Yeah, no problem. Kathleen Hutchison.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kathleen Hutchison. I live with my husband and daughter at 16353 84th Avenue Northeast. When we moved in, we moved into a neighborhood of homes built in the early 60s, plenty of trees, and the trees were all down the hill, and we had deer and eagles and whippoorwills and all manner of owls, all manner of wildlife in the area. For some reason, Joe Court bought the land next to us, and he was granted permission to build 8 houses on an R6 lot. This resulted in them building homes really close to the property line. They're about 6 feet away from the property line. There's only room for a deck. They don't have a yard. There's just a deck. In the process of doing that, he clear-cut the whole piece of land. It was 1.1 acres, not a tree left on it, even though the paper said he was to leave 10% trees. And in doing so, he cut the roots of all the trees lining our fence. So now we have one narrow row of trees along a 100-foot piece of fence. So far, well, we ended up, for safety reasons, we took 4 out ourselves because we had an arborist assess them at our expense, and then we cut them down, and that was about $6,000. Since then, one of our trees has blown in the wind onto one of those new houses, smashing it. And if somebody had been in the bedroom upstairs, they would have been dead. And the neighbors, understandably, are scared, and they want our trees out. And we don't want to take our trees out. It's like the only thing we have for privacy against these homes that are now built right on the fence line. And, you know, we have 6 kitchen windows staring right into our yard that used to be very, very private because the whole thing was just a big forest. We used to stare into the forest, and it was just wonderful. And just this past January, another tree fell in our yard, a 110-foot Douglas fir. And I saw it come down, and the sound of that hitting in the yard is really quite astounding. It's a small earthquake. And had it fallen on our home, you know, the trees are right outside all of our bedrooms. If the wind kicks up one night, they'll go in our bedrooms. So I just don't understand why, first of all, he was granted permission to build 8 houses on an R6 and to cut the roots of our trees. Because now, you know, we have to ponder whether we should take them all out or not at our expense. It's a couple $1,000s per tree. They're all over 100 feet tall. There's about 8 of them left. And it's kind of scary living there. So, and down the hill, they put in another brand new development. It was also clear cut. Up the hill, there's another one. It's also clear cut. They're putting in the sewage pipes right now. They just completely clear cut it. There's not a tree left on it, and I just don't understand how this is allowed to happen. We've also experienced settling of our house. The foundation has shifted. There's cracks in the walls that didn't used to be there. And I think it's because the hill is shifting. And so this is kind of worrisome for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Mosco Salman.
Hi, my name is Mosco Salman, and I live in 6190 Northeast 187th Place. It's up on the Kenmore Heights. I moved here in 1979, so I've seen all those things and wild animals. And in fact, I have 22 old growth trees in my house. I love trees. I enjoy them. Eagles nest in my house, and you know, a deer used to cross through my property. But you know, we have to be realistic about this. Trees, as we get urbanized and we get denser, trees pose negative. You know, they have negative aspects, and one of them is that prolonged dry seasons can actually make those trees flammable, and as we know, climate is changing and we're getting more and more dry. And I talked to a fireman this summer, and he said that yes, it will go up and up the hills, and all the houses in there, and we have no remedy for it. Our fire department is not equipped to handle forest fires, and this is a forest fire we're talking about. I'm talking about that particular West Kenmore Hills. So I'm not against trees, and I believe that we can come up with tree varieties that are better for our environment, doesn't topple over people's houses, and they're not flammable. They have stronger roots so they can hold on to the hills. And also tree height can be regulated so it wouldn't, like many communities. And we're losing our views. Now, you may actually think that I'm very selfish about this, but view is very important because the value of the properties go up, neighborhood is elevated, and gets better. And the solar panels is not going to work if the trees are growing. And I've seen them growing, really. I mean, I had a 360-degree view. Now I have like maybe 20 degrees view. So I'm suggesting that we initiate tree height regulations like South Mercer Island, any other places that have views, and to preserve our views and keep the level of neighborhoods, and also initiate tree varieties. So study, and have some tree varieties. I'm not, against trees. I think that we should have more trees, and if we want to have more, if we want to preserve the environment, if we have to adopt and adjust, to it, not because these trees are going to topple over. Eventually we're going to have to get rid of some of these trees anyway. So why not we regulate them and have more of them, and have safety from fire, from toppling over, from having solar exposure for solar panels and all that. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Massa.
Richard Wayman.
Okay.
You, oh, yeah. Okay. You're good.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. All right. Next item on the agenda. Excuse me. Is approval of the September 15, 2015 Planning Commission meeting minutes. And I want to raise a point here. I'm looking at those minutes, and it refers to approval of the September 1st, 2015 minutes, and it says Chairman Nugent moved that the minutes be approved. And I think that's unlikely, because I almost always say, in fact, I probably always say, do I hear a motion to approve the minutes? I don't make the motion myself. And secondly, I didn't attend the September 1st meeting. So it's unlikely I would have volunteered to approve minutes of a meeting I wasn't in for. Do you remember moving?
I do,
Okay.
and I was going to bring that up, so I'm glad
Thanks,
you
Darryl.
are. So if we can make that correction, I actually was the one who made a motion to approve the minutes.
All right. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes as amended? Thank you. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Nay. Any abstention? Motion carries. The minutes as amended are approved. Next item on the agenda, tree wind throw amendments continued.
Good evening, Planning Commission. Just in response to some of the public comments received, we'll certainly pass along the concerns raised about the development which is ongoing to Development Services, because again, recognizing that the concerns raised are to development that has either been ongoing right now or has occurred in the past. So we'll certainly pass on those concerns to the Development Services Department. So continuing the discussion on wind throw, is one specific topic that's being addressed in the tree regulations is wind throw, and the Planning Commission's had a lot of discussion about this, and staff has provided a lot of information about wind throw, and we've tried to provide a balanced approach to wind throw and develop regulations that would be consistent for both new development and for single-family residences. So that being said, I also want to recognize that there are two topics on the agenda tonight, tree wind throw and getting back to the topic of micro-housing and tiny housing. I would like to ask Ashley to, first of all, go over the Form 303 and the tree matrix, which I know the Planning Commission have wanted to see to be part of the discussion to make sure that they understand what the form says and how that process would work for single family. So Ashley is prepared to step through that, and I know you may have questions, but I think it would be helpful if you wouldn't mind holding those questions till after she's gone through those forms, if that's okay.
Fine.
All right, to begin, staff will briefly go over the Form 303 questions and matrix, as that might also answer some questions about acceptable thresholds and risk factors. These forms and questions have been reviewed and approved by an urban forestry specialist at the State Department of Natural Resources for accuracy and reasonable use. I think you guys all were handed kind of like a sheet of the questions if you want to follow along as I go over it. These questions were designed in a way that a staff member of Development Services can fill out the matrix based upon the answers provided by the applicant. The first question asks if the tree to be removed is within 50 feet of another tree. If the answer is no, the entire form can be skipped because the major issue is neighboring trees being affected by tree removal. If the answer is yes, the applicant will continue to fill out the form and would be asked to provide information on how many trees are in proximity to the tree being removed and the range distance of those trees, whether or not the trees are on adjacent property, and to provide an address if they are, the topography and natural environment of the tree, such as is it on flat ground, is it in a valley, is it on a slope, and the effects of the removal of the tree have on neighboring trees, such as would it leave trees shorter than the average canopy, taller than the average canopy, and also whether or not clearing and grading will be required for tree removal, and if so, how many feet within the neighboring trees. Following that, the staff would then take those questions and proceed to fill out the evaluation matrix, which was provided to you guys in the memo, if you want to pull that out and follow along. We also provided 3 examples to show you what a low risk, moderate risk, and very high risk scenario would look like. This wind throw evaluation matrix is to be used by Development Services staff to assess whether or not there is a preliminary risk of wind throw based upon the questions we just went over, or that I provided to you guys. And then the results of that would merit whether or not further assessment by an arborist is needed before permission of removal is granted. The matrix is designed to evaluate the level of risk on neighboring trees should the proposed tree be removed, since everything we've been witnessing and hearing complaints to City Hall is about effects post-development. So it's kind of like a domino scenario. So for the matrix, the tree to be removed is defined as tree X, and the tree being evaluated for increased risk due to removal or disturbances tree Y. The risk factors we used in the matrix parallel the risk factors we've outlined in the city in the proposed amendments for the code. One being shelter, looking at will the remaining trees be isolated or protected by a grove. 2, looking at height, will the remaining trees be taller or shorter than the average canopy? Trees lingering much taller pose the highest risk. Then it also looks at root systems, specifically how many critical root zones will be shared. The average critical root zone can extend up to 30 feet beyond the tree, and If there's trees within 30 feet of that, then those critical root zones overlap. If it's multiple trees, it's multiple root zones. The matrix also looks at activity. Will clearing and grading occur? Once grade changes around trees, that also creates risk and flimsy root systems. So it looks at will clearing and grading occur, and then within a range of how far. Then it also looks at topography and whether the remaining trees would be on flat ground, on a ridge, on the side of a hill, or sheltered in a valley. And then lastly, it looks at foliage and whether or not a tree sheds its leaves annually or not. After that, we kind of evaluated how we would rank and weight the matrix. We weighted all risk factors and gave it a value of 1 because staff cannot determine which risk factor bears the greatest risk, so we treated them all equally for the purpose of the preliminary evaluation. And then the level of risk has been weighted on a scale from very low risk to very high risk, so 0 being the lowest, 1 being the highest. And so each risk factor can receive up to 1 full point and as low as 0 for a total of 5 points possible. An example of that is shelter. If a tree is being removed on a neighboring property, but it still leaves adjacent trees sheltered by multiple trees, it's the lowest risk and it would receive a 0. And scores receive a 0 if that's the lowest risk because they shouldn't be given any points if no risk is present. At the highest end, trees that are left isolated, so 1 or 2 remaining trees on a lot or on an edge where protection's been removed, those would be the highest risk and receive a 1. To calculate the score, all the numbers for each risk factor would be added up to receive a preliminary total level of risk score. 0 to 0.99 would be on the very low end. 1 to 1.99 is low risk. 2 to 2.99 is moderate. 3 to 3.99 is high risk. And 4 to 5 is very high risk. Staff decided that any score greater than moderate risk would require further evaluation from an arborist before permitting of tree removal. We decided that should be the cutoff because when we looked at examples, you couldn't definitively say one way or another that it would or wouldn't occur. And we think when there's a question of it or any ambiguity, that's when it should be referred to an arborist. But there are clearly examples where it's very low risk, and staff would not require those people wishing to remove their trees to gain a further assessment. So the cutoff is at 2. And that takes care of the questions in the matrix. If you guys have any questions specific to that.
Does anybody have any questions specific to this or to the staff memo generally? Sorry, Mike, I can't see Deborah, but I think I got it. You got your hand up, please. Go ahead.
I have a few little questions about the matrix. Does this, somewhere else, I suppose it asks if the tree in question or trees in question are significant trees, because this only applies to significant trees, or not?
I think it's assumed because it only applies to significant trees. When you do the right now, Form 303 is only applicable for significant trees.
Right. Okay. So on the grid, it talks about the critical root zone, and there's a definition at the bottom of the grid that is different than what you just said verbally, which was 30 feet. And neither of those are kind of well, the 30 feet, you could maybe make some assumptions based on this, or I'm just not sure how that's addressed.
It's measured up the diameter of the base height, so 4 feet up from the tree.
Right.
What I gave was a rough example. It's saying like if a tree is, I'm not sure specifically what's in that, but I think the example that was listed in the matrix was for an example of a tree that's 20 feet in diameter at the base height. It would extend, I think it said 25 feet.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure how you would get that from the form. It's not.
From the form,
you
it
don't
would
kind of
be
call it out.
basically looking at if you know how many trees, assuming they're significant, which it does, and you can see how many are within like 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, you
make some assumptions.
You can make the assumption of, well, you would know that those systems overlap if it's a significant tree.
Right. Okay. And then the last one is, well, a couple more. Evergreen versus deciduous is also on the grid and not on the form.
That is already currently on the form, asked in one of
Somewhere else.
Yeah, it's asked right at the beginning of the form what the species is and is it deciduous or evergreen.
Okay. And then the last question, and maybe we've already talked about this, but I just can't remember. Would this kind of grid and decision process be carried over to the larger developer's tree plan stuff? Okay.
This was specific.
I know we talked about it being specific.
We were trying to find a balance versus, as it sits, all developers in the new development are required to already have a tree plan provided by an arborist where they already evaluate all these things.
Right. Okay.
This was a balance instead of pushing all those requirements onto single-family homeowners to first evaluate preliminarily if there's a moderate risk.
Okay. And then last one is just, technical, which is on the form you've got, yes, no questions for things that are really kind of forced choice joined questions. For example, the height one, taller than average height, shorter than average height. I mean, you want them to check off one of those, not yes, no for E. I mean, it's just a
this was just a draft made up to try and get at the type of questions we would have to ask for a staff member to be able to fill out the form completely.
Yeah.
Thanks. Anybody else? Yes. Vice Chair.
Well, I don't know if we're going to go into these more deeply, but I agree with the staff's recommendation for the tree protection plan about not recommending that we include that neighbors be responsible to share the costs of the wind throw analysis. I think that is a really heavy burden for someone who doesn't care to remove the tree in the first place.
Okay, I'd like to respond if I could. So I saw in the staff memo the response was to not recommend this. It's not fair. Why should a neighbor have to bear the cost of something that was created by a person who wants to remove a tree? And at the last meeting, I gave two reasons. One is that the person who wants to remove the tree, the cost should only be shared if they are using their property in a reasonable way, just as the person who wants the tree to stay was able to remove trees to build their house or a lawn or expand or a view. If the neighbor who happens to have a tree wants to do the same thing, it's fair that they get that chance without having to pay the neighbor. So the neighbor, and that speaks for itself. And the second reason was that the neighbor who wants the tree to stay gets the full benefit of all the costs that the person who has the tree has to bear when they want to try and remove the tree. So economically, it only makes sense that the person who gets the benefit should pay the cost. In fact, usually they pay the full cost when you get the full benefit. But that didn't make its way into the memo, and I was disappointed not to see that recognized in my response from the last meeting. Go ahead.
I guess I think it's, I don't know that that's an exact apples to apples comparison. I feel like if I do live on a steep slope, for example, and if I wanted to build on the steep slope, it could cause issues for my neighbors below me. If I wanted to do that, I would have to bear all the costs for it, right? It wouldn't be fair if I say, like, this is my property, I want to build on it, but my neighbor downhill is going to have to share these costs because they're preventing me from doing that, or because they're going to gain all the benefit from me not doing that, you know? Like that doesn't seem to make sense. If I want to do something with my property, I should have to bear the full cost of mitigating those risks for others.
I disagree. First of all, I don't...
Yeah,
go ahead.
perhaps we
I want
just
you to-
disagree.
Maybe we do, but
Yeah.
I want you to finish, too. I didn't want to step in. I thought you were pausing for that reason.
No, I think we may just not agree on this issue, but I think if I want to do something with my property, I believe I should pay whatever I need to do what I need to my property to change it.
Right.
That I can't force my neighbor to want to pay for some of that if I want to do that to my property.
Well,
remove a tree or build on a slope or whatever it is, you know.
okay. So I'm saying you're the person who wants to remove the tree for whatever reason, if it's a reasonable reason, is only doing what you already got to do. So you're imposing them an extra burden that you didn't have to bear. And now you're saying, well, your reasonable use of your property is creating this problem for me. So you should, not because you're doing something you want to do, but you should do something for me too. And that is alleviate this problem. It's not a problem that, you know, you created by doing something unreasonable. It's not a problem that affects your construction of your house or your remodel or something. It's solely a problem that I have. And it's rare, if in fact ever it happens, that when we do something with our property, we have to pay for everybody around us who doesn't like what we're doing.
Maybe it comes back to the point that I think that if I'm doing something to my property that potentially causes potential harm on another, then I think I wouldn't call that reasonable. I think I would, if I'm going to create a situation that could cause harm to someone else, then that in my mind is no longer reasonable.
But
Does
you've
that
got
make
to
sense?
do, yeah, it does. I get where you're coming from, and I get, and that's the staff's position. But you got to do the same thing. When you built your house, nobody stopped you. Nobody told you, don't cut that tree because it hurts me. You got to cut whatever you want. That's why you live in the house. That's why you got to build the house. That's why you have a yard. That's why you may have a view. You got to do all those things, but you're making new rules for this neighbor. Saying, well, now you can't do it because I don't like it. Nobody ever told you that when you built your house.
Well, rules do change over time. I mean, I used to live at Arrowhead Point,
Right.
and there was an existing dock that went into the water from that property. If you buy a property down there now, you can't build a dock. So, I mean, things change, rules change, shoreline management changes, tree protection rules change. We understand more about steep slopes than we used to. We understand more about wind throw, goodness, than we used to. So I guess, I mean, are you talking about sort of grandfathering in people who already are owners? I mean, I don't.
Actually, the old people are the ones who are winning here. They're like they're getting extra benefits here. The new people are the ones who are getting disadvantaged. But rules change for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, rules change. We're changing rules in City Hall and state government, federal government all the time. We're trying to make them better. But they change because there's a public burden. The government doesn't step in until there's a burden to the public. So shoreline rules change because there's detriment to the environment or there's, you know, some sensitivity to that area. But this is just two neighbors. This isn't a public thing.
I think it's a safety issue. Okay.
I agree it's a safety, and I want to get to that. But, you know, when I was looking at this, it occurred to me that the evil that we're all talking about here isn't the trees. In fact, nobody moves to Kenmore because they hate trees. This is a forest. We all built our houses carved out of a forest. If you hate trees, you probably live somewhere else. It's not whether you hate trees or you like trees that drives this debate. The real villain in all this is the wind. That's a natural weather occurrence. And the person who's living next to whoever's trying to reasonably use their property, build a house or create a view or whatever, landscape, or get rid of all the raking I have to do in the fall 20 times every weekend that I'm not up to doing anymore. Those are good reasons to remove a tree. But the thing about the wind is you're telling you, the guy who wants, or the owner who wants the neighbor to keep the tree, keep the neighbor's tree. Don't cut your tree. Can't cut your tree. Are saying you have a duty to block the wind from hitting my house or my trees. That's unusual to tell your neighbor, you suddenly have a duty to protect me against the elements. You know, I'm so old, I remember that when we had a problem with the elements, we actually fixed it ourselves. We actually prepared our property by putting up storm windows or fixing our roof or, gosh, yeah, we maybe have to cut down a tree if the wind's going to knock it down. It's really not the neighbor's fault that the wind comes up and it gets really strong every so often, or thousands of, you know, whatever big wind event there may be. We actually fixed it ourselves. We could even replace the tree. If we don't want, if our tree threatens to fall down on our house, we could take it out and get a smaller tree. And then there's a compromise in effect. But go ahead, Deb. Put your hand up in response.
Well, I sort of agree, but I think there's a subtle distinction that I would make, and that's that I would agree that it's not, you know, a neighbor's responsibility to affirmatively protect the other neighbor, but I guess I echo what you were saying before, that it's more about creating additional risk, that we're trying to prevent creating additional risk, and that the act of the tree removal may, and that's what we're trying to evaluate, create additional risk.
Yeah, but the neighbor didn't create the wind. That's the point of the tree, is to block the wind. It's sort of like water, you know, we all have to live with the rain. We have to live with water runoff, water runoff. Your neighbor doesn't have to do it to block the water from running off his property onto your property. You got to deal with it.
Oh, yes, they do, actually.
The common enemy doctrine doesn't burden the... We've talked about this. There's let me finish. The neighbor doesn't have a burden to stop the water. The neighbor can't increase the water by doing something unnatural to his property. But if the water runs down as a natural event, the neighbor has no more duty to block the water than you do. Just same with the wind. The neighbor has to deal with the wind. The neighbor has to deal with the wind for his problem, and the neighbor, now you're saying, with this law, has to also keep trees on his property to block the wind for the neighbor. That's an unreasonable burden. So, go ahead. Angela, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you. I think because we've talked about this issue for so long and for several meetings that it might be good, it would certainly be helpful, I think, for me to just clarify exactly what we're talking about. I'm going to say what I think, and maybe staff can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is we're just supposed to be speaking about the proposed wind throw issues. So we've learned about what causes wind throw. Wind is obviously one of those things. It can also be boring into the roots, cutting into the root systems, removing trees within groves, right? So we're really trying to decide as a team, like, if we want to move forward with recommendations on adding wind throw prevention, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not about the wind itself. Like, if someone wants to take down a perfectly healthy tree and it's not going to cause any issues or imminent threat on any other property, then they still can, right? So we're just talking about if someone were to remove a perfectly healthy tree that is going to cause potential danger for anyone. It could be people walking on the sidewalks. It could be a car driving by. It could be a neighboring house, right? But if it's going to cause any potential danger, then they need to have it assessed.
Mm-hmm. If they remove the tree, you're saying removing the tree is going to cause a danger to people walking by?
It could, if it's like a grove of trees and they want to remove 2 of them, for example, or even 1 of them, and then they start to lean over the sidewalk like many of the citizens said today, well, then it causes some sort of potential danger.
Removing the tree?
Yes. Yes. That's what we've been talking about, right?
No, I don't see how removing the tree threatens the neighbor. Who's on the sidewalk? Somebody's walking on the sidewalk.
It's leaving
I think
single trees.
Okay,
sorry.
What I'm hearing from a lot of people who are saying, I'm worried about this tree that may fall on my house. And my response last week, and again tonight, is, then let's change the hazard tree law so that the city has a duty, can force the neighbor to remove the hazard tree. And there's a lot of ways to do this. I know there was a lot of objection to this in the staff memo. Oh, you can't do that. Hazard tree law creates all these problems. I'd like to respond to those. But I emphasized last week, and I got feedback, and I think some of the people are here tonight, Bev and Christy, and they met with me after the meeting. They were very encouraged by what I said about the hazard tree law and recognized that's their problem, and that's the big problem around the city. With these windstorms, it leaves trees vulnerable to falling on the neighbor's house. That's a whole different story, and I agree, public safety, and that was the ostensible goal of this whole wind tree proposal, is to improve public safety. There's no evidence that it does, because all the neighboring communities around Kenmore in the August 29 windstorm got beat up as bad or worse than we did, and they have wind throw laws, and the staff's response was, oh, it'll take decades for it to really make any difference. I'm not sure it would make any difference in decades, because as I said at the last meeting, even if you don't remove trees, like say, this is why it's confusing. This whole wind throw thing is confusing. I have to catch myself, because the staff's proposal is the way to reduce trees from falling is leave the trees. And that's so counterintuitive. That's why I get messed up on this, and I think others will and have, and I think the council will. But even if you leave the trees, the wind is going to hit the trees that are left. And that wind pressure is going to make those trees fall. You're really not reducing the number of trees that fall. And I think the staff acknowledged that. So I'm not sure this provides any public safety benefit, but if your goal is public safety, then the clearest, simplest way to do it is to enforce the hazard tree law and not just making an exception to the tree permit requirement. So I see a lot of hands up, and I want to be sure I get them in time and give everybody a fair chance to respond. Carol hasn't talked to Debbie's.
But I think the staff have a comment before me.
Okay. And you yield the floor to the staff. Go ahead.
Well, I'd like to go back to what Commissioner Kugler started, was if she had captured the issue correctly. And I would like to say, yes, she has. It's one specific topic that we're addressing, which is wind throw, and we've addressed the reasons why we're addressing wind throw for development. We addressed that there was a gap, and the Planning Commission wanted to close the gap for single family. We've brought back a recommendation. Where we sit right now is we feel that we've brought forward a balanced recommendation to address wind throw for both development and single family. We understand that there was a lot of discussion and asked for additional information. We did a lot of research in addressing those issues, and we still feel that it does not warrant any additional changes, or would not recommend any additional changes to the recommendation that we've brought forward. That's where we are right now. And so I think the question for the Planning Commission is there's obviously still a significant divide on the Planning Commission on how to move forward with the recommendations on wind throw. And I think those particularly relate to the single family recommendations. And so we've actually said you have a couple of options here for how to move forward to the council. So I think that's where we're trying to get to tonight. I think you had a lot of discussion last week about these topics, and you could certainly rehash those again tonight, but I don't know if that would in fact move the discussion along any.
Thank you, Debbie. Go ahead, Carol.
I would concur with you, Debbie. I think that you have answered the questions that were brought forward in the discussion from last time. I think it's good to remind ourselves that these wind throw recommendations are a form of preventing. It's a preventative policy. That's what I would call it. It is not necessarily going to aid in any hazardous tree policy that the city may or may not want to include. But clearly with the different situations we have going on in the city, that would be something we would want to bring forward to the council, but it doesn't fit in this particular recommendation. But I think it's good that we had the opportunity to talk about it. We've brought forward many concerns that the council or the commissioners have thought about, different scenarios and things that we think potentially could come up. But I think that your phrase that you used, to close the loophole, because part of what's driving these recommendations is our participation in what is already law, and that is that we have an obligation as a city to participate in urban forestry protection, right? That's why we have this thing on the table. And those laws are already enacted and they're not going to go away. So what we're trying to do as a city is we're trying to create protections, policy recommendations that would give the urban forestry in our city protection. We're protecting trees. That's what this is all about. What's come up, though, is we want to also protect our citizens, and I think that through the discussion, we did talk about the things that are about the citizens. And that would be our recommendations, I think, as a commission, that all of this would be looked at, but I don't think you're in opposition to that as a staff.
I mean, the staff's role is to bring forward information to allow the Planning Commission to make a recommendation and to address any questions that the Commission raise. And I would say at this point, I think we've done our duty in bringing forward a recommendation and addressing Planning Commission questions. And at this point in time, I don't think there's any additional information that we could bring forward that would assist the Planning Commission in making a recommendation.
I just had one more thing to say. A lot of the scenarios of the hazardous trees people brought forth tonight were post-development activities where they complained about her roots being cut at the edge without any notification, and she had to remove trees herself at her own cost because they were at risk, and even one of them fell on her neighbor's house. The person who actually cut the roots themselves, a neighbor's tree, ended up falling. Everything we've presented is preventative measures to try and prevent these things from happening. But as they stand now, these trees people have presented that are hazardous trees, the city would never require someone to keep a hazardous tree. And that's outlined nowhere in the amendments we proposed. And as we showed in the memo, for imminent threats and hazardous trees where concern has been expressed, the municipal code already contains hazard tree law, which permits removal of a hazard tree, such as the ones people have complained about, when necessary to prevent or correct an immediate threat to public health, safety, property, or welfare. The issue at hand is that, unfortunately, their trees are not on their property. If they were on their property, they could remove them without a permit, submit paperwork the next day. But that, with them being on the neighbor's property, it's to try and regulate that through hazard tree law is, as we said in the memo and people have reflected tonight, is beyond the scope of this project. And that's all I had to say about that.
Thank you. Ashley, I do want to respond to that. I do want to respond to the staff's memo. I know there are other people with their hands up. I am going to call on them before I talk. But I do want to make a note that I don't think we're done, partly because we're going to be presenting this to the council. There's a very high likelihood there will be a minority opinion on this being presented to the council. And I would personally like to get some additional information, regardless of how the vote comes out. I still think there are a number of answered questions. I have to disagree that this answered all our questions. I think it avoided a number of the questions. And I'd like to bring up some of that, but so that we can make a fully informed decision. In fact, I think this made reference to the matrix, and there was, I thought I saw a statement saying the matrix is still in development. Is that right?
No.
Is that the attachment? Then I misread it, perhaps. All right. So, having said what I did about letting others go ahead.
I just wanted to comment. I have the floor.
You have the floor, Mike.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ashley, on your comment there, I'd made a note today about the language on page 4 of the memo, and I'll just repeat it briefly. Halfway through the page. Current practice is to treat tree removal issues between neighbors as a private civil matter. The city does not have a direct role unless a tree removal request is submitted to the city by a property owner. That seems very inconsistent with the wind-throw legislation that we're considering. It seems the city is taking a position when it comes to homeowner's desire to remove a tree if it might impact neighboring trees, but unwilling to take a role when a neighbor has a concern about a tree on another neighbor's property. And I think for consistency's sake, we need to be concerned either in both scenarios or neither. Either we're going to let citizens deal with tree issues amongst themselves as a private matter, a libertarian view that would probably find a way to self-moderate in the community, or the city has to play both sides. I think they have to be willing to step in and say, you know, that tree on property owner A's land is dangerous and it may destroy the home on property B's land, and we as a city are going to take some action here. Or they can't be involved on the other side. That inconsistency is troublesome to me. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Go ahead, Mike, please.
So one of the things I'm struggling with, I think I've mentioned it before, is we're taking this one piece, I think others have mentioned too, we're taking this one piece of the, you know, obviously larger tree issue, which a number of people have spoken to tonight. So I guess my question and maybe a little bit of a comment is, I know we're recommending that the city do a larger tree regulation review. What is the sense of urgency among the staff and the council to do that? I mean, obviously from what we've heard tonight, there's plenty of issues with new development. I'm just kind of trying to get a sense of how far down the future that broader look is coming. And I know it's up to the council to decide that, but what's the sense of when that might be coming?
Well, the city has changed the tree regulations several times. When the city incorporated, the requirement was just to retain very large trees and no other trees. And so a lot of the development that occurred then is sort of a remnant of that. The city adopted new tree regulations in 2003 to kind of take a more holistic look at retaining a certain amount of trees or requiring replacement trees. The city then amended those regulations, I want to say it was 2006, to increase the density of trees retained or the number of replacement trees. And there are certainly the way, so again, the city has done quite a lot in terms of trees. And this was one particular issue that we thought we needed to strengthen in those tree regulations. Whether it's still time to take a holistic, another look at tree regulations, I'm not so sure. Because I think a lot of the developments that are occurring now maybe have occurred outside of the regulations that were passed in 2007. It takes a long time for development to go from submitting an application for development to actually something happening on the ground. I don't know for sure whether the concerns expressed by some of the neighbors today are under the tree regulations that were passed in 2006 or 2003 or a remnant of those that were around in 98. So I don't know if council think that this is a priority to take on tree issues holistically again as a priority, or whether there may be some aspects of tree regulations that they want to address, whether it's some that you've raised as a commission, which I know you've already wanted to add to the list. So it would be something you'd have to ask the council. But I just wanted to let you know that the city has done quite a lot to try and protect trees.
Right, I wasn't questioning what's been done in the past, or the grandfather thing would certainly merit being looked at. But I'm just kind of wondering. It seems like there is, we've heard from a lot of people, and a lot of it relates to new development. So I'm just trying to get a sense of where this might be headed, because I think that affects how we look at this.
I think it would be, again, if it was something that you felt strongly about, you would put on the docket and ask council to include that on the docket, and then it would be a question of prioritizing that topic along with any other topics that are on the docket, whether it's the housing strategy or some other items.
Okay, fair enough.
Mark, anybody else? Mike, please.
We spent an awful lot of time on this, and I think it was good time well spent. I would certainly know a lot more today than I would have expected to have from looking at the original docket. Having digested and assimilated a lot of that information, I've gotten to the point now where I think I've got enough information to make a decision. on the specific issue that's before us today, which is fairly limited. And I want to thank the staff for the work that they've done. I think particularly in some particularly tense moments, this hasn't been one of the easiest things we've had to deal with. So thank you. At this point, I would concur with the recommendations. And I'm particularly concerned about timing. I think timing is an issue here, given the level of the speed of development that's picked up in Kenmore and the amount of permits that are out there right now. This is a loophole that needs to be closed now, as soon as possible. At the same time, I also believe that we've also learned that there's bigger issues here that maybe we do need to come back and take some time to look at. More time than we have on our docket and outside of the docket that we've been given. So, and I remind everybody, in case anybody's forgotten, that we already passed a motion that said that we would ask the City Council to put this on our docket, and we thought this was important. So with that in mind, that's kind of where I'm at right now, and once again, thank you to the staff. I think you did an excellent job on this. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Mike. Okay. I think the floor is clear. I think I'm going to step up and ask some of the questions I've mentioned and referred to before. Before I get too far into the memo that was given us for this meeting, I want to ask a question. It sounds almost silly, and I know that there's no way to answer this exactly, but is there a sense of how many trees there are in Kenmore? Because I know you take these 303s, and part of it's for doing a tree inventory. Is that right?
No.
Then what's the point of the 303?
The inventory related to the 303 is that for when you can only remove a certain number of trees per year.
Right.
So we keep track of the trees to determine whether 2 have been removed or 5 have been removed or how many have been removed on a single property. That's the only purpose.
Okay. But is there any sense or a way to get a sense of how many trees are in Kenmore? Because I'm going to guess it's a lot of trees. This was all raw forest before anybody started building here. If you go to St. Edward's Park, I'm guessing there are hundreds of thousands of trees in St. Edward's Park alone.
Hundreds. I don't think there's hundreds of thousands.
In St. Ed's?
Yeah.
There are, this is recent, a recent study indicated that there are 3.3 trillion trees in the world. There are 4 times more trees than previously thought. There are, gosh, how many trees per person? Anyway, I could dig it up, but it was surprising. Which isn't, say, good or bad, but I think it was something like 400 trees, 300 trees per person in the world. And if you multiply the 22,000 citizens of Kenmore times that ratio, it would come out to over 9 million trees. Now, I'm not saying there are 9 million trees in Kenmore, but I'll bet there are at least a couple 100,000. In any event, there are a lot of trees here. And I was hoping we had a sense of that, because it relates to the emphasis that the staff and these tree protection ordinances put on saving and retaining each additional tree, which is extraordinary when we already have so many. But the other question I had was, and Commissioner Orenshaw might want to interject here, there was a dialogue between Commissioner Orenshaw and I think it was Samantha, who attended the meeting last time, regarding how many 303s come to the city. I think Samantha said 5 per week, 1 per work day. And then Commissioner Orenshaw asked, and correct me if I'm wrong here, something like, do you think that reflects all the trees that people seek to cut?
Yeah.
Is it something like that?
That was my effect. Yeah.
And Samantha said yes. And my question is, how would you know? How would you know if somebody's cutting a tree without submitting a 303?
Usually people call, neighbors call.
So you're assuming that nobody calls because every time you get a 303, you don't get calls from people complaining about the neighbor?
I think over the years there's been some education that if you want to cut a tree down, you need to basically ask, and that's why we get a lot of, Samantha gets a lot of inquiries about, do I need to obtain a permit to remove a tree? If somebody removes a tree and it's in violation, and it could be a potential code violation.
You think most people know they've got to get a permit or fill out a form before they cut a tree?
Yes.
Based on the fact that people will call if a neighbor does it without filing a form?
Not just based on that, I just think that people recognize that there are tree regulations in Kenmore, and oftentimes people check, do I need a permit to cut a tree down?
Okay. Everybody I mentioned this to had no idea. You had to get the city's permission or fill out a form before you could cut a tree, including people, I won't even refer to what his or her position is, but people who are in a position to know. But so I don't think it's quite as widespread as you might think. And the other thing is, it doesn't respond to my question. How would even the neighbor know that his neighbor didn't call the city or fill out a form? You're assuming the neighbor will enforce that law against his or her neighbors, but there's no way the neighbor could know, and there's no way you could know the neighbor did or didn't know.
I think I've lost you somewhere in there, but I think the main thing is that what we're trying to do is put rules on the book, again, to address the issue of windthrow, to reduce that risk of somebody cutting a tree and causing damage to a neighbor. So that is really the basic reason for trying to do this.
I get that. That wasn't my question. My question was, how do you know this law is being followed or these forms are being filled out?
You do. Part of it is going to be,
or almost every time somebody seeks to cut a tree, and I haven't heard anything that indicates that we can tell.
But why would that matter? Like, we don't create laws and then know everyone who follows or does not follow a law, right? The laws are in place for public protection. So what would it matter if the city knows or doesn't know? Hopefully they should know, and hopefully people are following it. But if they don't, then they will probably be relieved that the law was in place so that they had this protection, even if they didn't know about it.
Can I answer?
But I think going back to this, I think we're mixing up things. I don't think this is about urban forestry. This isn't about saving trees. It's about public safety. That's it. It's just about putting in this one set of criteria for people to evaluate for windthrow, for the protection of others, and that's it. It's not, I think if we want urban forestry, we should talk about that separately. We should completely separate that from this discussion. It's not about saving trees for saving trees' sake.
Okay, can I respond? So,
actually, the recommendations that we're making right now actually fall into Chapter 18, which is entitled Tree Management and Protection. So this is all about urban forestry, but it is about one issue, and that's the windthrow issue, to strengthen that protection. It's a preventative protection. It doesn't cover every scenario, just covers windthrow, right?
Thanks. My point was, if I may, and I'll get to you, I'm not so sure this law is being followed, and I'm not so sure even if we pass this would be widely followed, that people would always fill out this form, and that they would, that this would have much influence on whether trees are cut or not cut.
You could say that about any law, any regulation, any permit.
Well, thanks. But I was simply looking for an answer. How do we know it's being followed? And I haven't heard one. I know people are angry that I even asked it, but I think it was a reasonable question about enforceability, which came up before, I think, the September 15th meeting. I think it came up at the September 1st meeting by somebody else. So I know people don't seem to like that question, but I think it's a reasonable question. Is this likely to be followed?
Well, we don't know what the probability of it being followed, but in this ordinance that we're working on, in the Chapter 18.57, there is a clause in it that talks about the penalties and enforcement. We're not going to be able to tell the probability if somebody doesn't follow the law. That would be like not creating a speed limit because we don't know if people are going to follow it.
No, I'm not saying that doesn't mean you don't do it. I think that's a real problem with the tree issue generally.
Okay.
And so, and as I said, I've talked to people, they're surprised.
Yes.
You mean I got to fill out a form before I cut down my own tree? Really?
Yeah.
The trees, it's not in a critical area. not on a steep slope. I got to get permission? Don't I own the tree? So that's the kind of thing I'm getting at. But,
Well,
Mike,
we'll certainly make sure that there is, perhaps if this does get passed, that there is a broader education out there as well, whether it's through the newsletter or other sort of social media to the community at large.
Mike?
I get a sense that we've probably done as much as we can on this, so I think it's time for a motion.
I disagree. I think we're still debating it. I've already said
I can't make a motion, or you just keep talking over me until I stop? I'd like to make a motion that we accept staff's recommendations as they stand.
I think, may I?
I second it.
Okay, I'm the chair. Okay, I'd like to chair the meeting. I think, Mike, what you're proposing is a motion to close debate, because it is still being debated. That's an extraordinary motion. Maybe I finish? My understanding of
I'm leaning over. I'm not speaking. Go ahead.
My understanding of Robert's Rules of Order is that a motion to close debate requires a 2/3 majority. So is that your motion, to close debate?
No, I made a motion I made it the way I intended to be, and it's the motion that I put in front of us.
Okay.
I believe that after a motion is made and seconded, there is continued discussion before you move to a vote. I believe that is per Robert's Rules of Order.
That's true. That's true.
Thank you. It is true.
That's why I said it.
So I've made a motion.
Okay.
As chair, I believe you now ask for a second.
Mike, can I speak for myself? I think we talked about this last week. Mike's making a motion on something I think we've already voted on. Is that right?
So you did pass a motion 4-2 with one abstain to move the staff's recommendations forward. There are a couple of very slight changes in tonight's staff recommendation to make the factors concurrent with the Form 303 matrix. So it is slightly different.
All right, Mike, do you want to rephrase your motion?
No, my motion stands. My motion is that we accept the recommendations that are presented to the staff as they stand.
I didn't know what you mean by as they stand. So as now the new recommendation that they presented
Yes,
tonight.
the recommendations that are in front of us today presented to the meeting tonight.
Thank you, Mike. Do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, now time for discussion. Is there a motion to close discussion, or can we discuss? Thank you. Anybody want to comment on Mike's motion? I'm going to comment, but I'm ceding the floor to anybody else who'd like to do so. No? Okay, thank you. So, getting back to the staff memo, Carol had made a point about preventative, that the wind throw law was a preventative measure, and that brought to mind this paragraph at the start of the memo. It's in the second paragraph on page 1, and it says, the proposed amendments are preventative policies that provide a pathway towards mitigating increased wind throw events in the future. Then it says, and I'm skipping a few words here, the next sentence, for imminent threats, the municipal code already contains hazard tree laws, comma, a reactionary policy. So you're saying the hazard tree law is reactive, which is not good, and the wind throw law is preventative, which is good. Is that right?
It's not that reactive is not good. It's just that it's in place to address imminent threats where you won't have time to go through a whole preventative procedure. It's the threats occurring right now. It can be handled, and the city code allows that tree to be removed.
But the preventative, you're saying it's reactionary, but the hazard tree law would be enforced before the tree fell. Wouldn't that prevent the tree from falling if the tree were removed under the hazard tree law?
No, the way hazard tree is defined, it, as outlined in the memo, specifically talks about trees that have been damaged to post-construction activities, which are at increased risk of failure in, it's outlined there. I don't have it specifically in front of me, but it was in the memo. And if that tree is threatening someone and it's in their property and they feel like it's toppling over, they can remove it they're allowed to, they're permitted to.
Under any circumstances, regardless, tree, whether it's.
Yeah, but there's also, it
damaged or-
specifically also states the way it defines a hazard tree and allows removal is, it's anything, yes, but it also addresses due to post-construction activity. And you can remove that tree if it's an imminent threat. We defined the proposed amendments as preventative because we're seeking to put protections in place that prevent hazard trees due to post-construction activity in the future.
Under the wind throw laws that you're proposing?
Yes.
Okay. So here's my point. You've got this word reactionary applying to hazard trees as if it only does any good after the tree has fallen, I think. And then you go on to say, a reactionary policy that permits removal of a hazard tree when necessary to prevent or correct an immediate threat to public health safety. My point is, it is preventative, and it's more effective than the wind throw law. First of all, it's broader, and then if it were enforceable, the city could then require the person with the hazard tree to remove the tree.
But you're
Create
only
public
talking
safety.
about trees that are already fallen over and leaning. So yeah, it's preventative in that it allows that, it's preventing that specific hazard tree from falling over. We're talking about preventing healthy trees from becoming hazardous trees.
Okay. I think it sounds like they're both preventative. So we had a question about sharing the burden if the property is reasonably used. The vice chair and I had a colloquy about that a little bit. And the staff objected to the use of the word reasonable use, because it was too vague. And they thought it would be too vague to be enforceable. And I'd like to point out that the reasonableness standard is objective. It's used in numerous laws. It's been used in the nuisance law for hundreds of years. The neighbor's reasonable use of their property is allowable, but if it's so unreasonable as to unreasonably burden the neighboring property, then it may be create liability. So I think reasonable is an objective and reliable legal standard. It's used in negligence law as well, which is a huge body of law. So I guess I have to disagree with that, and for that reason, I guess the staff refused to propose a shared burden. Well, they did. They added shared burden language, but they made clear that it was not their recommendation. So reasonable was too vague, and then later in the memo, we asked for a specific risk threshold language. Maybe that's a way we could try and come up with something more concrete. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm paraphrasing the memo, and it said, well, specific risk share threshold is too specific because there's so many variables with wind throw that we couldn't have a specific standard. So it sounds like on one hand we're proposing reasonable, it's too vague, and then we ask for, okay, something specific. No, it can't be specific because there are too many variables. It's like we can't win either way, and the staff did not come up with any specific risk threshold language. So I felt like we didn't get what we asked for in that sense. Getting to the hazard tree law, which I've advocated to address the many concerns we've heard here, the staff's response was, oh, that would create a lot of problems. How could somebody inspect a hazard tree on somebody else's property without permission to enter that property? But it seems to me the same problem exists with the wind throw laws that you want to enforce. If you've got a tree that's blocking the wind and it gets removed and it may create wind throw risk to the neighbor, you're saying that the person who wants to remove the tree has to get an arborist report and comment on how to eliminate that risk. Well, that arborist can't get on the neighbor's property to assess the risk to his trees any more than the problem you rose for the hazard tree law to assess the risk for the hazard tree. It's also on somebody else's property. So it looks like a double standard's being applied here to these different laws. I will say that a lot of cities have hazard tree laws where the city can require an owner to remove a hazard tree that's a threat to somebody or to person and property. The staff objected in its memo to the hazard tree law by saying the city attorney, they consulted with the city attorney, and the city attorney raised concerns about liability the city might incur if it were to expand the hazard tree law because the city might be deemed to be obligated to conduct an inspection. Then there were questions about, what about permits? Who would be the permit? Who would be the person who would get the permit? Would it be the applicant? Would it be the neighbor? This is very confusing. So I would think from that kind of analysis that no city would have a hazard tree law that would be enforceable, but I don't think that's the case. There's a book here. I don't recommend it necessarily, but I've seen other real estate lawyers recommend it for their clients who are having trouble with their neighbors. It's called Neighbor Law. It's written by some attorneys in California. It's about 20 chapters. And 6 of these 20 chapters have to do with trees. That's how big a deal trees are with respect to neighbor relationships. And in one of the chapters, they talk about unsound trees, and there's a section called Getting Help from City Government. And it says, city governments often step in to take care of or make the owner take care of dangerous or unsound trees. If you are imperiled by someone else's tree, contact your local city or county government. In many cities and towns, after the appropriate city office is notified of a dangerous or diseased tree, it will demand that the owner eliminate the problem. In some cities, if the owner doesn't respond within a brief time, 48 hours for instance, the city will step in and remove the hazard. It then bills the owner for the cost. Some place a lien on the property if the owner doesn't pay. So it sounds like there are a number of cities that have just the kind of law I'm talking about that I think will respond to the public safety concerns without putting the kind of burden on private property owners that the wind throw laws would. And in fact, as I said, we've got no empirical evidence that the wind throw laws have helped reduce the number of trees that have fallen because of wind events in surrounding communities that have wind throw laws. Hazard tree law would have an immediate and much more effective impact on public safety. So that's why I think that's the approach. If our goal here is to improve public safety, that's the way to go. The wind throw law is it doesn't seem to be doing much good, and even if it did, let's assume it did do some good, it would be a very narrow window of safety that it would create. It's only in those trees that are sought to be cut that would have an impact on the neighboring tree. With hazard tree, it'd be any tree, wind throw or no wind throw, that's threatening to damage a person or property nearby. So those are my comments on this memo. I disagree that it's answered all our questions. I also have some concerns about the language that we're left with in this memo. If we look at attachment 1, I think this is the language that we're being asked to adopt. Bear with me. There's the matrix. Sorry. The wrong memo. Here's the current memo. Here's attachment 1. So if we look at attachment 1, section 15.25.070, permit required exception, subsection B2B, it says clearing and tree removal. These are exceptions to the permit requirement. Removal of any significant trees on lots that contain existing single-family dwellings, and that B would not increase the likelihood of tree wind throw. So this is where I said, hey, I thought we were going to limit this to significant increase in the likelihood of wind throw, and I pointed this out in a memo. I pointed this out after the staff said, we don't know what you're talking about. I said, this is the language I'm talking about. And I had the sense the staff would insert the word significant, and it's still missing. So that concerns me. Then as we go through this attachment, we move on to section, I think it's the 3rd page of the attachment. And it's section 18.57.050. Subsection C2, and this is the new language, it's highlighted. An assessment of tree wind throw potential as described in section 18.57085, along with any proposed mitigation measures to prevent wind throw. And prevent looks new to me. I think we used to have minimize there, is that right? Is prevent now replacing minimize? Because I don't see minimize anywhere.
it appears in a further section under tree protection plan. It says when significant wind throw potential is identified for trees that could impact neighboring properties, the applicant shall identify measures to minimize wind throw as part of the tree protection plan.
Okay. So prevent was there all along, is that right?
Correct. And 1857-085 is the section that's referenced.
Thank you. Is there a way to make sure that anybody could take measures that would literally prevent wind throw? I mean, isn't it possible that there would be a major wind event that could cause wind throw no matter what, whether the tree is left or not? This is a very high, almost impossible standard to meet, it seems to me. So we've got different standards throughout this proposed language.
So I might respond. I would certainly say that on that first section, 1525.070, staff would have no objection to including the word significantly in front of increase, would not significantly increase. Right. I have no concern there. And then also if the desire is to replace the word prevent with minimize, I think that's appropriate as well. I think the notion of minimization and that it's for significant risk appears in the actual discussion under the evaluation and prevention of tree wind throw, which is 1857-085.
Okay. So, but if you're sticking with prevent and minimize, I think it's, and we disagree on this, but I've said it before, I think literally to minimize or literally prevent is a zero tolerance standard.
I disagree with you.
I know, I've said that, but I think it's too onerous a burden to put on anybody. I don't think anybody could realistically live up to that, at least without having to remove the tree. It would almost, I don't see how it couldn't require you to remove the tree. I'm sorry, keep the tree. That's why I get confused, as I said before. We're talking about stopping trees from falling, but we're being told we have to keep the trees, which is counterintuitive. Anyway, I think it would always mean you keep the tree, or even plant more trees. So that's my problem with this. There's inconsistent language and it's a zero tolerance standard. So let me see if I've got anything else, and then I think we can move on to any further discussion, then on a vote on Mike's motion. Bear with me for a second. Least intrusive means. So I asked for a response to, maybe we can get language in here by which there's least intrusive means burden imposed on the person who has the tree, who wants to remove the tree. And the staff response of, that's too vague. So we're back to the, well, you're either too specific or you're too vague. None of it works. I don't think there's a real effort here to try and find language that's compromised language that we might all agree on. So it's another reason I have for objecting to this. And see if there's anything else. I think that's it. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your willingness to let me speak. Anybody else have comment on the motion? Go ahead, Mike, please.
Well, maybe more on the memo than the motion. On page 2, this is in the paragraph titled Acceptable Threshold for Wind Throw. And as I understand this paragraph, it's the process that occurs after the initial evaluation is made and the matrix is completed and a score of moderate or higher is achieved. The arborist report is returned. And then it appears there's a final determination that's made based in part on the arborist's report, and then no specific threshold for unacceptable risk is being considered, looking at the language here. Right. But then it lists some considerations that would be made, and that's what I wanted to talk about. The first consideration listed in the list of examples there, with the section of the sentence that starts with IE, what is the desired reason for tree removal? That one sparked something in me, especially when one of the citizens spoke tonight about his concerns, which are very different than some of the things we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks. forest fire risk, or accessibility for solar power. You know, we haven't talked about what do trees do to our ability to put solar panels on our house, and I don't know how to evaluate those things necessarily, but I do know there's a lot of reasons people either do want trees or don't want trees that I haven't thought of yet. I do know it seems that for the city to ask that question, why do you want to remove that tree? It seems like an innocuous question, a good question, but I'm not sure the city needs to be in the business of evaluating people's desires or weighing them against each other. Is your view of Mount Rainier more or less important than my desire to build a wine cellar attached to my home, or somebody else's need to build a landscape patio, or a vegetable garden? I mean, when we ask a citizen why they want to do something, and we're going to evaluate the merit of their response in making a decision of whether or not we're going to tip the scale of whether or not they can take down a tree that we've already assigned a moderate or high risk of wind throw to, that seems to open up a box of trouble. So I know you're not putting that in here as a list of questions that are definitive or definitely to be asked, but that's a concern that I have, that if you're going to start asking citizens, why do you want to take down your tree, and you're going to get a lot of answers, and when I say you, I mean the city, right, as a part of that follow-up, I'm not sure that's an area of municipal governance we necessarily want to be in, of evaluating people's reasons for doing what they want to do.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. You know, if I could, it did bring to mind what you just said, something I thought about too since the last meeting, and I wanted to bring up tonight, and I know there's so much going on, it's hard to remember it all. But with respect to public safety and trees, there's another point I think that's getting completely ignored here, but I think it's relevant. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, oh, the science, you're ignoring the science if you don't pass this law. There's a lot of science that's involved here, not just arborism or wind throw research. There's economics, which is a science. There's also seismology, and there is not conclusive, but a large and growing body of evidence and a consensus in the seismologic community that there is going to be an earthquake in this area within 15 to 30% chance within 50 years, but eventually we are decades past the statistical average period of time for a major earthquake. And one of the effects of that earthquake is trees are going to be falling all over the place. And for all the effort we're putting into protecting public safety by keeping trees, it's a reasonable point to make that only increases the damage, injury, and loss we're going to suffer when those trees fall during a major earthquake. So it's reasonable to let, and this kind of tacks on to Mike's point, these trees belong to the people who own the property. They don't belong to the government. Nobody's making you plant a tree. Or preventing you from planting a tree. Any owner can plant a tree if they like. They get that choice. But these laws are saying you can't cut your trees, and you may have good reasons to do it. And I think if we're talking about public safety, I think it's fair to say, you know, what about the effects of an earthquake, the inevitable earthquake? Is it such a good idea to go to great lengths to protect every tree, especially significant trees, the really big ones that would cause the most damage when they come down? That's a reasonable public safety consideration. Anybody else? All right. I think that exhausts the discussion. Go ahead, Mike.
Just want to amend my motion. Doug had made several suggestions that the staff had decided that they would make changes for. I'd like to include those. My amendment covers those three changes.
I had two: would not significantly increase the likelihood of tree wind throw, and use of the word minimize instead of the word prevent.
Thank you. Yes, those two.
So I just want to be clear, too. I know the staff had presented a motion. The commission voted on it. I think it was in July. That was the one that passed 4-2 with an abstention. Was that without the neighbor notification and the hearing examiner requirements?
That included that.
The July memo?
Correct.
So this motion, or the adopted language requires notifying the neighbor and requires that any appeal would go to a hearing examiner before somebody could go to court?
Correct.
Okay. Any other clarifications on the motion? Okay, we'll do this by roll. Commissioner Mulcair?
Nay.
Commissioner Orenshaw?
No.
Commissioner Kugler?
Yes.
Commissioner Nugent votes no. Commissioner Vanderline?
Yes.
Commissioner Srebnick?
Yes.
Commissioner Baker?
Yes.
Motion carries 4-3. Next item on the agenda is micro-housing apartments.
Correct.
Commissioner Vanderline?
What would you say to a 5-minute break to kind of
I
create some
agree.
distance here and clear the air a little bit?
The commission is recessed for 5 minutes. Micro-housing.
Right. Well, it's been a long time since we talked about this. We last discussed it on July 21st, and that was sort of an introductory session when we talked about what microhousing is and different approaches to microhousing. And at that meeting, a wise suggestion was made that we split the discussion into two pieces because they may be handled very differently. The first piece is microhousing apartments, so apartments, the smaller than a typical studio apartment. And the second piece is tiny houses. And what we hope to do, accomplish tonight, given the time, is to go through the microhousing apartments discussion. And then for tiny houses, I just want to say we are on the cutting edge of trying to address tiny houses. And we've taken a stab at it. And if the Planning Commission is interested in pursuing regulations for tiny houses, what we're recommending is that that we confirm that with the City Council, that they want to take that on. I have recommendations included in here, but before we would take them to hearing, if the Planning Commission wants to move ahead with the topic, then we'd get City Council concurrence with that before we would move to hearing. So what I'm hoping to do tonight is to just get a sense of whether you're interested in pursuing it so that we could potentially take that topic to the City Council at the same time that your joint meeting with the tree recommendation moves ahead. So I'll start with microhousing apartments. I don't know that I need to go over the size, but there were several questions that commissioners raised at the time of that July 21st meeting, and I'll just briefly run through those. The first question was, well, where would they be allowed? And staff's perspective is that basically microhousing apartments wouldn't really be treated any differently than studio apartments. They're just smaller apartments. And would be allowed every place that an apartment might be allowed. And so I included a copy of the zoning map. I listed the zones. And then there was a concern expressed that, well, how many people might live in a microhousing apartment, concerns about crowding and that kind of thing. So the zoning code doesn't really have occupancy limits for apartments. They do say that if one family is allowed per dwelling unit, but that a family can be up to 8 unrelated individuals. It doesn't include children of people living in the situation. The building code, on the other hand, does have a minimum size, and it says that a microhousing unit would be considered what's called an efficiency dwelling unit. And I went over this with the building official to make sure we were talking about the same thing. And that says that a minimum room size of 220 square feet, not including the bathroom or the closet,
would be required. And for those units, if you want to have more than 2 people living there, you have to have an additional, more than an additional 100 square feet. So staff is recommending that a minimum size be put on microhousing apartments to reflect that building code minimum, and also to make it clear that no more than 2 people could live in a microhousing apartment. So if you were to look at page 2 of the memo, these are this is the beginning of the proposed code amendments. And the first one is just to, as in the code currently, different types of like apartments are defined, etc. So we would be defining dwelling unit microhousing, an apartment with a total square footage of less than 320 square feet, and a habitable space is defined under the building code of at least 220 square feet. The rooms are intended for use solely by the dwelling's occupants, although common kitchen or bath facilities may be provided. Then under the definition, farther down you'll see under apartment, we now note that microhousing dwelling units would be considered apartments. And then on the next page, the definition of dwelling unit would be amended. And the reason for this is that some microhousing apartment units do not contain kitchens. Or if they contain a kitchen, then you're into this question of, well, what is a kitchen? Is a kitchen a hot plate and a mini fridge and the bathroom sink, or what exactly is a kitchen? So what we are recommending is that the definition of dwelling unit to be amended so that it says usually containing kitchen facilities and rooms with internal accessibility, to pick up the fact that that they may be shared kitchens, or their kitchens may be in the unit, or it may be some sort of modified kitchen, so that we're not into that question of what is a kitchen and does this unit have it or not. So those are actually the only code amendments that we are thinking of for the microhousing definitions. Then in terms of standards, the standard change that we're recommending has to do with parking. And so there have been studies done in this area that do show that folks living in microhousing apartments generally don't have the same number of cars as or have as many drivers as for larger units. And so staff is proposing a 2-tiered approach. So if the microhousing unit, microhousing apartment, is within a quarter mile of 522, the transit corridor in the city, then the parking ratio would be reduced to 0.6 stalls per unit. And that is higher than some of these other places found, but it matches the recommendation that was done specifically for Kenmore for transit-oriented development. So we have a good handle on what a minimum parking space might be, and that is 0.6. Beyond a quarter mile, we're assuming that it's too far to conveniently expect people to walk to transit, so it would go back to the studio apartment parking ratio. So, questions?
Deborah?
But just in general, I'm trying to wrap my head around the economics of this. I mean,
Yeah.
Are these the kind of things that once you kind of allow them, there's going to be a whole bunch? Or do the economics from the developer's perspective kind of balance that out so there wouldn't be?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can answer that question specifically for Kenmore. I can say that as a general model, it's been very successful, and not only in this part of the country, but around the country. It's definitely a model that people are interested in and is generally well received.
The only reason I
Now-
ask is because I mean, the maximum is 2 people, so it really doesn't foster the kind of family friendly. So I guess what I'm saying is if somehow this sort of boxed out other kinds of lower cost.
Well, it's certainly, I mean, no, probably a whole family wouldn't live in there. It certainly could be a single person and a child. It could be a senior. Often it's young people who are in their 20s and can't afford something more expensive. So I guess it contributes to the notion of a whole community. There's a place for everyone. I think the other point I was going to make is we've had 2 inquiries. This is more of a suburban market, and I don't know that it would be as popular here as, for example, in the heart of Redmond or downtown Seattle, for example.
Anybody else? Mark?
I just had a couple questions about the parking. First of all, the 0.6, how does that work for disabled parking? Is there some provision that's separate for that?
Right, that's a separate provision that actually is in the building code.
Oh.
So beyond a certain number of stalls, you have to provide a certain number of ADA accessible stalls. And I truly don't know off the top of my head what that ratio is, but the same ratio presumably would apply
to this. Okay. And the other one had to do with, does that have any effect if there's, less parking, maybe you've already figured, emergency services, vehicles, access to these apartments, does that have any effect at all? Are we talking parking we're talking on-site?
Right, correct, on-site. Right, on-site. We're talking on-site parking requirements. And I wouldn't, the notion of having fire access, that's something that's reviewed with every development, but I guess I wouldn't see it any differently for this type of an apartment project as any other apartment project.
Okay. And just to clarify in the kitchen, they are or are not required to have either an internal kitchen of some sort or a communal kitchen? I wasn't quite clear on.
Right. So the way the code currently reads is that you have to have a kitchen.
Of some description.
Inside the unit. To be a dwelling unit, you have to have a kitchen.
Yeah.
And so this is saying you usually have a kitchen, but it's acknowledging that in some projects, the kitchen could be a shared facility.
But it's one or the other. In other words, there will be a kitchen there for the people who live there.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Right. Or it's a different kind of it wouldn't be considered, it'd be a different kind, like a congregate living situation, or, it would be a different animal, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Mike?
I think the question about usual, that word kind of bothered me because when I read that, it implies that there may be circumstances where there would be no kitchen.
Yeah,
Okay,
I read it the same. Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like everybody is having that same issue, so we need to clarify that.
Your language about if you change it to some kind of shared arrangement, a common arrangement, or
Right.
some better language in there.
Right, okay, so for example, containing kitchen facilities, then something about or shared or communal kitchen or something like that. Okay.
So this, if nobody else, this raises a question in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Could this bleed over into creating issues for mother-in-law units, ADUs, which are, they require the owner to reside in the residence, right?
Correct, right.
I'm trying to think, if somebody occupies a separate area of the house, but there is no kitchen, just wondering if this could create problems for people who are now that somebody's complaining, a neighbor complains and says, hey, there's somebody with an illegal ADU next door.
Mm-hmm.
and the city comes in and it's pretty innocent setup where there's no kitchen, but there's sleeping and other living quarters. And the city says, well, technically, you know, this is an ADU and you're in violation.
Mm-hmm. It's usually the opposite. In my experience, it's usually the opposite issue, but we'll have to think through if we're talking about shared or communal kitchens. So typically what happens is this. There may be an ADU, and there's a complaint, and an approach is made, and the person says it's not an ADU because it doesn't have a kitchen.
Right.
And what's a kitchen? Then you're into this whole discussion of what is a kitchen. So from that perspective, this language actually could be helpful if you were concerned about ADUs, using the word usually. Now, when we go to this different format, I'll have to think that through. But it gives you the option to say, this looks exactly like an ADU. And the fact that you have a microwave and a mini fridge and a sink, and you're telling me you don't have a kitchen because you don't have a wired-in oven is not good enough. This is an ADU. But I think what you're asking, Doug, is whether in an opposite situation where you have someone who has an artist studio and they have a sink and maybe they have a bed in there for guests, then if we change this language, then maybe they would be in a position to be faced with a challenge saying you are an ADU when in fact they're not an ADU.
Right.
So I see the point.
I'm worried about the unreasonable neighbor who's trying to exploit this to say, hey, I don't like you and I'm going to use this to beat you up because you're, I think, doing something fishy when they're not.
Right. I definitely see the issue. So let me tinker around with this language and see if I can strike a happy medium where it'll work both ways.
Thank you. Anybody else? Carol?
I'm unfamiliar with ADU laws. So like if somebody wanted to have someone room in their house, that's not considered an auxiliary drink because you didn't change the structure or add a little place out there or change the garage into an apartment or anything.
Right. An ADU is a separate dwelling unit.
So it's a separate dwelling unit, and how do you distinguish that? Is it actually separated from the main residence, or is it just separated?
Well, it has to meet the definition of a dwelling unit, which is the point that Doug just raised. We have to be careful what we do with that.
Okay.
But you can have an accessory dwelling unit that's included in your house.
Okay.
But it really has to be independent. Or if your lot is large enough in Kenmore, you can have an accessory dwelling unit that is detached.
Okay.
It's a separate structure on your property. Either way, the owner has to live in one of the two units.
Okay, so, but what you're talking about with the little studio, it's a separate building, but it doesn't have all of the bells and whistles to be qualified as a dwelling unit.
Right, and that's the fine point of this definition.
Point. Okay, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. So do you need anything else from us? Do you have sort of the guidance you're looking for?
Did any other questions about any other sections, or if I work on this one, you bring that back?
Are we just talking about micro-housing or tiny houses?
Just micro-housing for now.
At this point, right.
Carol?
I do have one question on section 1880.0440 on the public benefit and density incentives. And I did read through that, but could you just give me the cliff notes on why the city is going for micro-housing and tiny housing to get these perceived benefits?
Yeah. The two are kind of unrelated. The reason that code section was included was because I wanted to point out that, in fact, in some single-family zones, if you meet certain criteria, then maybe you could do an apartment. So that was just put in there to clarify that in case anybody wanted to review those standards.
Could you say more about that? I must have missed that.
Right. It's
I mean,
an
how a
existing code section.
Okay.
And what it says is, let me get to it here.
Okay. I mean, just the fine point of if you're in a single family neighborhood.
Right. In the
okay.
the R4, I think it was the R1, R4, and R6 zones, if you provide affordable housing, so that's committed affordable housing, then you can do a benefit unit, you can do an apartment through a review process.
Okay. Already. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So this isn't a change.
No,
okay.
This is not a change. You just had said, where could an apartment be? And so I didn't want to say, not include those zones, but I wanted you to see when you could maybe do that. It's not like in any single-family zone you can do an apartment whenever you want. It's specifically tied to this chapter.
Mike, did you have a question?
Oh, just at some point, maybe inform us a little bit, as we talk more and more about denser housing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in how the city, you're going to have a more concentrated use of city resources, everything from sewer, lines, everything else. How is the city compensated, or whoever part of the public is providing this house, how are they compensated when you have more, you allow denser housing, which I'm assuming is going to create new costs?
Right. So how, because we have more folks living here, how is that translated into Kenmore resources? Is that?
Sure. I mean, if what we're doing is we're taking hopefully not single family, but we're taking a less dense use and we're converting it either from it's not nothing, no development there at all, or to some more dense. We're going to use more city facilities, everything from sewer, everything else. They're going to have to go in there. Is that at the expense of the developer? Is that at the expense of the public? How does that work?
So it seems that would be the case, but in fact we're not recommending any density changes.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
So it's just that they're going to be tiny, but there aren't going to be more.
I think I asked this question when we talked about it before, and you answered it the same way. Satisfied then as I am now.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Carol.
Just to tag on to that, just because this has come up before with our power outages and stuff, with the tiny houses, there is a density issue in that if you take a dwelling space, let's say you converted an apartment that had 4 units and you made 16 units. I can't imagine how you do that, but let's say you did that. Mm-hmm. Those 16 units, even though they might not have significantly more people using power, there will be a stress on the power grid. Is the city going to address that issue with the utilities?
No.
Okay. So
and I think the issue is this. The planning that occurs in the city presumably reflects the growth that is anticipated. And because we're not changing the density, we're not saying you can now develop, instead of developing at 18 units per acre, you can develop at 50 units per acre. We're not changing the expected number of dwelling units at the maximum. Does that make sense? Maybe I'm not making this clear. So regardless of how big the units are, in an R18 zone, you can only get 18 of them per acre.
Bingo.
Okay. And in fact, you might have less people, because if you have smaller units, you're going to have less people.
Right.
So, yeah.
And probably in our R18 zone, I can't imagine that someone would want to do a microhousing project, but in some of our higher zones, maybe. But the maximum density has not changed, and therefore the planned impact should not change, and as Deborah points out, could potentially even be less because there might be fewer people per unit.
Sorry, I just had to ask.
No, it's fine.
All right, anybody else? We good? So are
Okay.
you comfortable with the direction?
I'm comfortable. I'll work on this dwelling unit definition.
Okay.
Okay, so the second piece of it is, this was the memo that we just included this time, having to do with tiny houses.
Before we proceed,
Yeah.
I've always run it by the commission, I should say, to proceed at this late hour, whether we approve, whether you want to adjourn, so I leave it up to you again. Do we have any objections to continuing?
I think the staff was just looking for, do we want them to take it to council?
Right.
Yeah, so hopefully
But I
it's
mean,
pretty
just
quick.
moving on to this, I
Oh,
agree
yeah,
with
yeah.
that too.
Okay.
I mean, my inclination is to continue, but I want to give anybody who objects a chance to say so. I don't see any objections, so that being the case, go ahead.
Okay. So you've read the memo, and I think you all decided last time that one of the significant issues would be utilities. And in fact, that proved to be a significant issue. I mentioned that although several jurisdictions, and particularly Portland, I call it the Portland Planner because I keep reading about tiny houses in Portland, although they've started discussion about allowing permanent siting of tiny houses on wheels in their communities, truly, I could not find regulations. So there are several thoughts going through my head about tiny houses. It's new territory. It's a very much an issue that many people are passionate about. I think it's possible to work our regulations to address tiny houses and still maintain some protections. But we would be potentially we might incentivize people to come to Kenmore with their tiny house because we actually have regulations. In many places they can't go because the regulations aren't there. So for all of those reasons, that's why I guess I was thinking that if the commission wants to pursue it, maybe a check-in with the council would be appropriate before we got too far down the road, in a public hearing, for example.
Okay. Anybody have any questions about whether we should pursue it? No questions? If I might ask. So you've talked about various kinds of tiny houses.
Right.
Utilities, permanent, temporary.
ADUs. Right.
A lot of, and they're prohibited typically, right? Because there are minimum size requirements for most zoning.
Right.
Residential zoning.
Site-built tiny houses can be built in Kenmore now with no issues except the minimum sizes that the building code requires. It's a slightly different it's two different building codes. This was an interesting thing that I learned. But where is that number? I want to say, right. 120 square feet, and then you have to have a certain, other rooms have to be a certain additional size. Okay. So if it's site-built, can build it, it's a house, it's just small. Then you have the tiny houses on wheels. Yeah. And those, some people want them just temporarily. They're on wheels and they want to be able to haul them away and move them someplace else. And some people want to use them as a way to get around those minimum size requirements. By putting them on wheels, the building code treats them as recreational vehicles. And they don't have to meet the minimum size standards. And so those folks may really want to permanently put their tiny house, which is smaller than the building code would allow, on a lot. So there are the temporary ones and then there are the permanent ones. So I tried to break it out into those three different categories because they kind of all have different issues. And then separate from that is the question of a tiny house as an accessory dwelling unit.
So we're really just deciding whether to move these other issues, the wheels, the tiny houses with wheels, and the tiny houses that are temporary to the council, because the other one's already allowed.
Right, or to, not in any way, I'm not saying we're ready to make recommendations or anything like that. But if you are interested in the topic, if you think there's a place for it here in Kenmore, if you want to pursue the question, however it ultimately comes out, then it seemed appropriate to take that back to the council and say, by the way, we're thinking of going down this path of looking at tiny houses in some way, shape, or form. Maybe they're only okay as ADUs, or maybe only for temporary.
So this was put on our docket by whom?
Microhousing was put on the docket by the council because we had received inquiries from the public, and we felt like we were behind the curve on microhousing apartments.
Right, but I mean tiny houses.
Right, and tiny houses came up during the course of the microhousing discussion
So it was
together. So it's kind of
your
an
research that created this separate
right,
issue.
Exactly, exactly.
All right, and what I was getting at is why are people, because it's not allowed. Typically, zoning says you can't have temporary tiny houses, you can't have these kind of tiny houses with wheels. Do you have a sense of why people object to that in single-family residence-owned areas?
Well, the way the code currently reads is you could have it's treated as an RV, and you could have it like for 3 weeks.
Right.
And so my reading of why people might not like it mostly has to do with the utilities or the appearance. And that's why, for example, when I was looking at amendments and talking with development services, they said, well, talk about screening of the wheels and making it fit more with a traditional single-family pattern. And then the notion that, no, you can't use RV hookups for something that is going to be on a lot permanently. That's just not, that's not okay. I mean, you need to make permanent provisions for your utilities if you want to be there permanently.
Okay. Any other comment? All in favor? Mike?
Yeah, I guess I'll make this point. I do know that maybe this is related. So many of the roadside espresso stands, of which Kenmore has several, also use RV-style wastewater disposal as opposed to permanent sewerage hookups. And I don't know if that creates issues around sanitation. I know they don't have flushing toilets inside. It's mostly for water disposal. Maybe that's gray water, right, versus black water. And a lot of those aren't, they're not on wheels per se. So maybe that's more like site construction. But they're not exactly permanent either. Sometimes they're built off-site and dropped on-site, like a modular home might be.
Right.
I don't know if there's anything analogous in that scenario, like when we think about it from zoning, and that's clearly commercial, which your memo says this is not about commercial, this is about residential.
Right. I didn't know that. I think that's interesting. I never would have guessed that. I think probably where my concern was more with the black water, with the sewage treatment.
Right.
That having a temporary solution to that maybe is not in the best interest of the community.
Right.
So what you're just looking for a direction of, do we want to?
I'm just looking for a direction of, do you guys want to pursue this topic?
At all?
At all.
Like even explore it?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Explore it, talk about alternatives, talk about draft regulations, conclude that ultimately, no, we don't like these and we recommend against them, however it falls out. But to continue to pursue it, it seems like we should do a check-in.
So do I hear a motion? Somebody want to make a motion on whether we forward this to council? Carol?
I make a motion that we forward this topic to the council and get direction from them.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Any further discussion? No discussion. All in favor say, go ahead, Mike. Do you want to jump in? Okay. All in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed say nay. Abstentions? Motion carries.
Great. Okay.
All right.
So next time, I'll bring back the microhousing apartments stuff, and we may put a hold on going much further with the tiny houses until we hear back from the council.
All right. Anything else? Is there any new business? There being no new business, Mike? No? There being no new business, I hereby...
I'm sorry, just a question.
Please.
The tree thing, when's that going to the council? The tree.
Yeah, I think tentatively October 26th, I think, is the soonest agenda we could bring it forward.
And that's with us or just?
Right, it would be a joint meeting. Mm-hmm.
So we could address the presentation at the October 20th?
Correct.
Meeting?
Yeah.
And if commissioners wanted to prepare a joint minority position, they could, because there would not be a quorum. The minority being only 3, could consult among themselves about the content thereof and the presentation thereof.
I don't see why not.
Okay. All right, this meeting is hereby adjourned. Thank you.
Just want to let you know that the skate court dedication is scheduled for Saturday at 11.